Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and today I would like to share my top 10 books of 2024. As always, these books weren't necessarily published in 2024, that was just the year in which I read them. And what I have decided to do today, for the first time ever when it comes to one of these types of videos, is taking a leaf out of Ben from Ben Reads Good's channel, and actually a fair few people. I have decided that I am going to do a ranking. So we are going to go from the book that just made it into my top 10 all the way through to the book that I am calling my favourite of last year. So coming in at number 10, we have The Wheel of Time, The Dragon Reborn by Robert Jordan. This is the third book in the Wheel of Time series and is also a book that I read incredibly quickly. I'm quite certain that I read this over 2 days because I was just so enveloped by this hefty tome. If I wasn't reading the book, then I was listening to it. This is one of those books in a series when we reach a turning point. And I knew about this from reading what people have said about the series in the past. And in reviews, people said that a lot of things come to a head in this. And this is really the last book where Robert Jordan seems to draw on the story from The Lord of the Rings and takes his world and his characters off in different directions. I have the fourth book ready to go and I'm looking forward to seeing where he takes the series, but I have found that I'm really enjoying spending my time with these characters and seeing the world expanded upon. It feels like one of those things where you get into a really good series and you know you've got quite a few to get through. Like last year when I watched Modern Family and I watched that for the first 6 months of the year, and it's just nice to have these books there as like just a staple, something that I can pick up and go to when I'm looking for a good read. I've heard people have criticisms of these books. I have yet to get to the books that they're being critical of, I don't think, and maybe they haven't liked them, but for me, I found this just the type of classic fantasy fiction that I like at a specific time of year. There is a sense of adventure here, and while I do have certain issues with the way characters are presented, for the most part, I have enjoyed this tale and seeing where it's going to go. The next book we have is another surprise to me. So last year I was doing this thing where I only read the books from my shelves. And in doing that, I was also looking at the ones that I wanted to keep. I became very much the type of person who doesn't finish a book if he isn't liking it. And I also started unhauling books from my shelves that had sat there for a very long time. And one of the books that I picked up was Written on the Body by Jeanette Winterson. And I was going to unhaul this book unread because in the past I've read Jeanette Winterson. I had to read one of her books for university and write an essay on that. And I read the book that she wrote for Hammer Horror as well. And I was thinking maybe I'm not a fan. Maybe I don't understand what the writer's doing. And I don't know whether it's because I'm much older than when I read her first book. But when I started this, again, similar to The Dragon Reborn, I was enveloped by the story and read it incredibly quickly. What I remember most about this book is the evocative prose. The first line of this book, having just reminded myself, is, "Why is the measure of love loss?" And I can remember wanting to understand that as somebody who regularly wants to explore and see how grief is explored within fiction. Having love and loss be so closely intertwined with one another was an aspect that I really wanted to see explored, and I think it was explored well in here. It shows the strength of love in this book, and I think it is a twist on a love story. It's not something that one would expect. It's a literary take on a love story, and it also made me feel like I could go and read more Jeanette Winterson and perhaps have a better understanding of it now that I'm older. And I do think that's something that I'm going to do in future, especially now that I'm allowing myself to buy books again and borrow books from the library. Jeanette Winterson is definitely an author whose works I wish to explore and also return to. The next book is Rare Singles by Benjamin Myers. I have been meaning to read this author for years. I always go back to being at Holmes Chapel Library and all of the group there had read The Offing by this author. Then one of the readers had gone and read The Gallows Pole and was shocked because of the content and the language within there, and they'd wanted something more pastoral, more parochial, something that reminded them of The Offing and thought that's what they were going to get. And when I was in Whitby, I saw this book. I'd heard about this beforehand because it was set in Scarborough, and as somebody told me at the time, I could actually go to Scarborough whenever I'm visiting Whitby, but I never do. There is something when me and my mother set foot in that town that we ain't leaving. We're settling down for a week and then we're going back. And Rare Singles was one of those stories that I really like because it's about an unconventional friendship. It takes place over one weekend, and yet you see these characters begin to unfurl from themselves, and through meeting each other. This book is short because this book is just the spark that these characters needed to go on and improve their lives. They've been living in ruts for a long time, and this book isn't about them going on to do like these hugely amazing things. This book is just about these characters no longer accepting less than their worth. And I thoroughly enjoyed this. I thoroughly enjoyed being in the Northeast in these pages and just the evocation of that. It really led to me wanting to go and explore more of Benjamin Meyer's work this year. And yeah, this is one that I'm looking forward to returning to. It was superb. Next we have Tormentil by Ian Humphreys. This is a poetry collection that left me wondering if I even write poetry. It was so brilliant. This is a collection that explores nature and grief and intertwines the two in a splendid fashion. The way that Ian Humphreys writes poetry is what I like. It's not just the experimentation with language, it's the way that the poet connects words together in a fashion that I hadn't expected to evoke the most from the reader. There is so much when it comes to poetry, for me and for a lot of people, where it's condensing something down to its purest form. And I think that Ian Humphreys did a fantastic job. This collection is very much connected to the moorlands where Ian Humphreys lives, or around the area in which the poet lives. The connection that the poet has to nature also builds the connection between the reader and the poet. As I say, this collection had me wondering if I could even write poetry, and left me wanting to actually go and learn more about this form of which I think that I'm jumping aboard. I really thoroughly enjoyed this, and as with most poetry collections that I enjoy, I look forward to going back and rereading it in future. Number 6, we have Black Swan Green by David Mitchell, and for me, I'm noticing that what I've enjoyed most about the books from 2024 is whether they manage to evoke space and time well. I seem to be looking for something where I can feel like I'm very much centred in the book. I can hunker down, I can get rooted in to a setting and then just explore the story that the writer wants to tell me. And I think that in Black Swan Green, David Mitchell did that incredibly well. In this book, we are following Jason. It is the 1980s and we're following him for 1 year. And this captured male adolescence incredibly well. It captured the time incredibly well. At some points I did wonder, was David Mitchell throwing in a few too many references and trying to build up the place for the reader too much? But I understand why the author did that. And I think that for a lot of people, this is going to bring back a lot of nostalgia for a time, but also it captures that unsurety that one has as a teenager, especially as a teenage lad, of not wanting to do certain things because it might be seen as too gay or too feminine, especially in the 1980s when there was a lot in the media, there's a fair bit of homophobia in the media and online nowadays, but it was being very much foisted upon people back then. Jason writes poetry and is worried how that might be seen. I just connected with this protagonist. It showed how much can happen in just 1 year of a person's life. The way this book ended felt inevitable, but I was also mildly shocked that it ended in that way. It's not this huge explosion of a climax. It's very subtle. It's the way that things happen, but it also goes to emphasise the way that when we are young, we don't really have much control of our lives or what's happening around us. That did leave an uncertainty and a lack of assuredness to the book that I particularly appreciated. Maybe I'll go and try and read the David Mitchells that I DNF'd last year at some point, but this was one I was thoroughly glad to have finally got around to. And now we have the top 5. And coming in at number 5, we have The Whalebone Theater by Joanna Quinn. I'd been told how great a book this was. I'd been told that I was going to really enjoy this book, and well, everybody else was right. This book is really a story of sibling relationships. In the beginning, Christabel is waiting for her new mother to arrive. Her father has remarried after the death of his first wife and Christabel's mother, and she's sure that when this stepmother arrives that she's going to have the mother figure that she wants. But Christabel is a bit of a knout in terms of things, really. She behaves in fashions that are almost looked down upon for the time in which this book is set. I think this book begins, so this book begins in 1919 at the end of the First World War, but it covers the Second World War as well, which did lead to a sense of impending doom for the reader when they know what's going to be coming for the characters. And you can see this from the first page, really. The contents page of this book tells you what years we are going to be focused upon. And anyway, Christabel's new stepmother has a baby, and then she has another baby. And throughout this, the reader knows that her stepmother doesn't really care for Christabel and doesn't want the children to be getting on with each other as well as they are. But Christabel really takes on that older sibling figure of always making their siblings do stuff. And she begins to write and create plays, hence the Whalebone Theater. It did remind me of when I was younger, putting on Christmas plays and making my siblings act them out and also sing songs. Maybe this is why my brother hates Christmas music now, because I would make him learn Christmas songs and sing them at Christmas as part of like a pageant. Anyhow, these little theatre performances that Christabel decides to put on become somewhat famous, and then we get to see her entering into adulthood and seeing the relationships between the siblings develop and how close they become. And Joanna Quinn uses the siblings in order to show more of the world than we might necessarily get to see. As I say, there was something that happened towards the end of the book that I felt like was inevitable, but because we are following the characters through nearly 2 world wars, we do get to see grief explored. And I like to see grief explored in fiction. I think that this did it well without becoming too overly sentimental, and in fact the straightforwardness with which the grief was written in this book lent itself to more sadness than I think there would have been if the author had decided to be overly sentimental. It was written with an incredibly deft hand, because there were moments of pathos and comedy within this book's pages. And if I hadn't enjoyed the other books on this list a bit more, then this could have easily been in a top position. My top 5 books are certainly just, well, I'm going to call them incredible. Like, this top 10 were my favourite books of the entire year, so naturally some are going to rank a bit higher than others, but the Whalebone Theater, this is definitely a book that I think would suit a lot of sensibilities. We reached book number 4, and I didn't expect a middle grade fiction to reach the highs that this one did, and that is the Whisper Wicks, the Labyrinth of the Lost and Found by Jordan Lees. Let me tell you the story behind this book first. I'd had this idea for a children's book in June last year, and I was looking at the middle grade fiction to see what was popular. And I happened to see this book leaning out from the shelf. I thought, well, I'll pick it up. And I started reading it. And I had to put the book back on the shelf to go to the writers group. Whilst I'm in the writers group, I can't stop thinking about the prologue of this book. And I'm hoping beyond hope that when I get back downstairs, the book will still be there. And it was, and I borrowed it, and I read it, and it was the best middle grade fiction that I have read in a long time. We are following the character of Benjamin Meyer, whose parents seem to be on the brink of a divorce. And one night, a flying monkey appears in his bedroom, and his parents don't believe him, and they think that he's acting out because of what's going on between them. And one night he follows this and ends up in another world in which the richest people in this world steal the colour from children's eyes. And there is a villain within here who's made a dress for her daughter from the colours from these children's eyes. There is a creepiness to this book that works incredibly well. It's the kind of creepiness that I adored as a child. It is tense. It's a brilliant adventure that discusses friendship and it discusses grief. The world in which these characters live is dark and twisty like Oz. It felt like there were so many links towards classic children's literature. It was simply sublime. I really enjoyed seeing the relationships between these characters, and Benjamin ends up joining this quest to find another character's brother. And I did not expect that aspect of the tale to end in the way that it did. I think that this is just a fantastic piece of children's literature. I'm glad that it's Waterstone's Book of the Month for this month for children, and I'm really looking forward to the sequel that's coming out later this year. Then we have a book that I read early last year. It did not leave my mind, and that's the case for the top 4 books here. I kept thinking about them throughout the entirety of the year. They lingered in my mind, and this one is Sheep's Clothing by Celia Dale. So Grace and Janice are released from Holloway Prison and immediately set about continuing a life of crime, going around and scamming older people. However, Janice wants a way out. She wants to grow up and find a relationship and believes that her life will be severely improved if she just finds a man and settles down. But Grace, who's been in this life and living this life for a very long time, sees that there is no way out. She takes on this maternal figure for Janice. Both of them head off and start relationships with men. And one of them is about love and the other one is about continuing the con. I really thoroughly enjoyed this. This was a book in which we're following 2 villains, but I really wanted to see them succeed in their machinations. And you know from quite early on that the police are going to be watching these 2. And it's funny as the reader watches, there's a dramatic irony as the net begins to close in Grace and Janice. And as a reader, I was hoping beyond hope that they'd find a way to escape. And I won't say how it ended, but it brought a wry smile to my face when this book ended, just because of the way things turned out. I thought that it was just a supremely well done book. I might not have got on with the author's other book, A Helping Hand, but that hasn't stopped me from going out and buying another book by this author, because she was writing crime fiction in a different style than I was used to. And whilst this was dark, I found it humorous and I hoped for the best for the characters. And I could not stop thinking about this book the entire year. The only problem I ever had was that this character on the bus was blonde, and there isn't a blonde character. In number 2, we have Motherthing by Ainslee Hogarth. This is an incredibly dark, graphic, gruesome book that ends in a way that I did not expect. It has some really dark, twisted conversations within the pages and is not a book that's for everyone, but it captured my sense of humour incredibly well. So basically, Abby and her husband Ralph have moved in with Ralph's mother. And then Ralph's mother goes and dies. And Abby might have stolen her wedding ring. And then we get a little bit of a ghost story. Abby is certain that she is being haunted by Ralph's mother. And we get to see a book in which Abby's running about trying to find a way to exorcise this ghost from her house and have a better relationship with her husband. This was like Blythe's Spirit meets Monster-in-Law, adding touches of gory humour from like Scream Queens and that sort of thing, some irreverent conversations about cannibalism in there. I just thought that as a black comedy, this was brilliant. It was horror and comedy mashed together in a stupendous fashion of which I was particularly fond. It suited me to a T and only misses out on the number 1 spot because the next book is one that I thoroughly adored. And also because I think you have to have a specific certain type of humour for Motherthing. And I had it. And I was thrilled. And I'm really looking forward to the author's next book. And then finally, coming in at number 1. And I don't know whether this was the book that was in number 1 on my official ranking. But when I was looking at my books, this was the one that I realised that I thought about a lot more because it had kicked off my reading of Elizabeth Taylor last year. And so this is The Soul of Kindness by Elizabeth Taylor. If you followed my channel last year, then you will know that I read all of the remaining novels by this author that I had to read to have read all of them. and The Soul of Kindness was the first one that I read. It follows Flora, who gets married, and upon her wedding day decides that now she's going to have nothing to do with her mother because that's her past life. And Flora has this idea of the way that the world should work. She tries to pair off her friends into relationships because she thinks how much nicer it would be if those friends got into relationships with one another, despite the fact that one of them is a gay man and the other is his best friend and they have no interest in each other. She tries to force them into a relationship. She will have nothing to do with her mother, despite the fact that she really ought to, because her mother's still around, but Flora's already treating her like she's dead. She has this idea that she is this really kind person, the soul of kindness, as the title tells us. But we get to see a very big case of toxic positivity from this character who has all of these friends and family members orbiting around her, but she is really the centre of a lot of catastrophes. And I still go back to a chapter in the middle of this book, which is, I believe, the longest chapter. It's set at Christmas, and it shows all of the characters at Christmas, and because of Flora's machinations, because of everything that she's done, these characters are now all alone, and it really delves deep into what it means to be lonely, to know that you have all of these friends supposedly that once upon a time you could have called upon, but because of certain things that another person has done, you now feel too uncomfortable to do so. This was such a fantastic book at sharing characters and showing all these different characters and their lives, and it's really quite plotless in terms of the grand scheme of things. We are just following these characters, but I think it gives us a real sense of time and place and what these people were going through and what it meant to live in this, like, we're quite far away from the war when this book was written. I think it goes to show the trouble we can get into when we deify other people, and the need to perhaps recognise we ought to live our lives for ourselves rather than anybody else. Again, what is it one of my writers says at the writers group? This book is pungent with setting, pungent with place, and the characters aren't half bad either. I particularly adore this book, which is why it is in number 1. I was recommending this to anybody who wanted to get into Elizabeth Taylor. I was recommending it to anybody who was looking for a piece of classic fiction from a much maligned English author. And yes, that was my number 1 book, The Soul of Kindness by Elizabeth Taylor. That's that, really. Them's the books. That is my top 10 of 2024. Have you read any of these books? What were some of your favourites from last year? Feel free to let me know in the comments. If you've made a video like this, then also let me know. I would love to see some recommendations. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, because until next time, that is all.